As you followed in the curriculum, you realize that we have now transitioned through two particular breakpoints in the book of Romans. Taking a look at the doctrine, theological, and we worked our way through that all the way through chapter 8. And then we moved from chapter 8 to chapter 9, 10, and 11 last week, which was national, having to deal with Israel. We're going to move now chapter 12 to the end of the chapter tonight, next week, on that which is practical. Something that Paul does all the time in his epistles. He'll present theological, and in the shorter epistles, Ephesians and Galatians, and even Philippians. I mean, he'll do theological, but then he'll do practical. They're not national. In Romans, that happened to be a means for him to address an issue that was quite significant for the Roman Church. Dr. J.I. Packer is noted to have said, some of you remember the very first time I taught, that theology is not what it should be unless it leads us to doxology. Theology is not what it should be until it leads us to doxology. It should lead us to praise. It should lead us to a life that is conformed and changed as a result of our understanding of theology. Theology is not given to us as found in the Scriptures just simply to whet our appetite or to give us a sense of arrogance that now, we know that we know that we know. And as you know, it's a process in our sanctification as well as it is in life in general. We start out knowing that we know, and as we move a little way along the way, we eventually reach a place that we know that we know. And then we reach that level where we are mature as we think because we know. And then we finally reach maturity. And that's when we know that we don't know. So we're pretty much there tonight. We know that we don't know. And we're in that 12th chapter. Therefore, what is therefore? You need to ask that question, yeah.
Well, like when we read in chapters, it relates to something that was said in like a previous thing, and to bring it up.
And we have to stop and think when we come to a word like that. They're little words. Therefore, but, nevertheless. Always taking into account. It's something else I want to be certain to play out as we look at these chapters ahead of us. There is systematic theology, there's biblical theology. Biblical theology takes you through book by book by book, and you follow the theology of each book. Systematic is the broad picture, the subject matter and what's taught throughout the entire Bible on that subject. Context, even in our study of one book at a time, which is more along the lines of biblical theology, what we're doing here, we're studying a book, studying Romans, and what Romans has to tell us. But it would be remiss of us and remiss of you, and some of your answers to your questions reflect your limiting yourself. And I'm not saying that you were wrong in doing that. Just keep in mind that as you have a question and you're looking at the subject matter and you're looking at the chapter and you give an answer to that, let's keep in mind there's a lot more context to refer to and to draw from than just the book of Romans. The phrase is very often used, Pauline theology. And if you talk about Pauline theology, you're not limited to one particular book. I mean, he wrote the better part of the New Testament. And so to reach out to other portions that touch that particular subject, that the question is only to your benefit. When I gave those questions out, I saw them as a good tool, and I'm grateful that you have spent the time, and I trust that it's been a benefit to you. As you answer the questions, I have to believe it has been. that has forced you to really think through. But as I said, there's much more. You've barely scratched the surface, and those of you who have gone exceptionally long, you've barely scratched the surface. And so when Paul jumps in and says, therefore I urge you, yes, he is bringing out the whole sense that something has been laid out for you, something that should lead to a life change. List and discuss the things Paul wants believers to do to present an acceptable sacrifice to God. And those of you, as you were responding to that, gave a vast number of comments. Some of you were extremely thorough, and others short. But you recognize that Paul wants a response. He wants us, particularly, the idea of a living sacrifice is a turning away from the Old Testament concept and turning away from the idea that we do something one time a year or something of that nature, but it's a living, ongoing experience. The intent, frankly, this is exactly what Paul is saying here. Our theology, what we've learned, it leads to what? The sense of doxology. This is your spiritual act of worship. I'm reading that of the NIV. You have different words, but that is truly, I think, the closest and fairest translation of that Greek word, and that is our act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. Everything he follows through is in this 12th chapter. Breaks down a pattern of life, how you should live. And there's the pattern of the world, and there's the pattern of the Bible. Keep that in mind. These words I've chosen are very intentional. Pattern of the world is a pattern that follows the mindset of carnality, the mindset of godlessness, the mindset of humanism. And the mindset that Paul is promoting is the biblical mindset, that which is based on what God has revealed in himself in the Scriptures, and in what God has revealed of himself, he's revealed of his expectations for you and for me in our day-to-day walk. It is not a matter of the tangible for the intangible, the materialistic to the spiritual. It's a matter of a pattern of life. And those factors do play out, but basically when we look at the Scriptures and we see the references throughout, say, the writings of David and his comment about all of that which surrounds us, and the heavens declaring the glory of God, the firmament showing his handiwork, day unto day of the speech, night unto day knowledge. But then he reaches out as he makes his way through that 19th Psalm to the idea that it's the Word of God that is a true revealer of the heart of God. And it is of tremendous impact and benefit to us. It's greater value than gold, greater value than silver. It is the source of all wisdom and understanding and insight. But then again, as James puts it, and now you can start bouncing. All right? What does James do with it? If it's like, okay, it's a mirror. You go to the Word of God, you see yourself in a mirror. And, many a day you don't like what you see. So what do you do about it? That Word does nothing for you if it doesn't bring change to your life. And so that's where Paul is driving at. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is good and pleasing and perfect will. How does a child of God prove the will of God in his or her life? Oh, I got all your answers, but if anybody thinks you have the best answer, then you can share it with us. We're going to go on and talk about that. Yeah, Elijah.
Well, I don't think I have the best answer, but I just wrote one way that a child of God can prove the will of God is by reflecting, considering if they're going to be more like Christ. Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians 4:3 that the will of God for our lives is our sanctification. So in that process of sanctification and seeking to glorify the Lord, we grow to be able to discern the will of God by stacking up biblical things against the options of the world gives us.
Okay. Want to add to that, anybody?
I just put God's word.
Okay. All right. You did the 3 or 4 of you that did the paper. 6, 7, and 8 really unfold this. Then you will be able to test and approve. What do you mean then? By allowing the work of God established, that's a base 6, and the whole idea that we are baptized into his death and we're risen to new life. And the recognition that it is a demanding relationship day by day for us to recognize that we still have a sin nature, and we come through 7 into 8 and acknowledge the fact that we are likened to what Jesus teaches us. He is the vine, we are the branches. It is the Spirit of God. We have been given life in his death and resurrection. We are abiding in that vine, but it is that Spirit's presence and that yielding ourselves and drawing upon the power of the Spirit of God to be all that we should be. That's a relationship. I was in a service this morning, and the pastor, or the speaker, it wasn't a pastor, he was talking from John 1, and that was his contribution of the Christmas message. And he's running through, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so he talked about at the beginning was the Word. And he said with the Word, and he used by illustration, like I'll have burger with fries. And then he moved on. He used that as an illustration, which then, sometimes you lose me in a message because my mind. And then he went on, and the Word, it was with, I read in the beginning, the Word was God, the Word is God, was God. The beginning of the Word was, and the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then the Word became flesh in verse 14. He went on through the entire 18 verses. But anyway, point with. That's my point. I want to stay with. Okay. What is that with? It's not burgers and fries. And when you think about it, you remember our study at the time that we talked at great length concerning the Trinity. And we come to that John 1 passage. The beginning was the Word. And we are talking about the Logos, was about Christ. And the Word is with God, and the Word was God. And the whole sense of that is found in the Greek word pros, and it carries with it a greater sense than just, I got this, and this is with this. See, that's pretty, simplistic, right? But that's what we think with, right? Pros is one that is intentionally given by the Spirit of God to emphasize the fact, face to face, communion between the two, as one, distinct in themselves, and yet one, and the beginning was God. And so, as you see, you have the Word, beginning was the Word, and you're thinking of Christ, because he comes down and explains it. And, the Word was with God, all right, and now you're looking at that sense of the triune, the Godhead, and then the Word is God. Okay. There's an incredibly deep statement that's made there. But as I was sitting there and rummaging through that while he was speaking, I thought, Emmanuel,
God with us.
God with us. And if we work through that same sense, you have, and I think it's fair for us to do so, we come to a saving knowledge of Christ. We've been talking all about the details in the early portion of Romans, all about the words, the redemption, reconciliation, justification, all of these incredibly deep words. Well, where does it bring us to? It brings us, and should bring us, not just to the sense that my name's written in the Lamb's Book of Life. That's a wonderful thing. But if that's all you think about, then how much have you lost? Emmanuel, God with us, face to face. And we only know that face to face through the work of the Spirit of God right now. But one day, he writes in John, one day we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Our whole process of, and I go back to 6, 7, and 8, that whole sanctification process is moving us onward toward that. And now in chapter 12, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. How will I prove and test what God's will is? By tapping into, by walking day by day in the Spirit, not just to know this is what I should do, therefore I know what the will of God is. And that's too often where we find ourselves in our limitations of trying to make it, work and figure all the pieces out. Everything we learn here, as Paul then moves on concerning the sense of grace, the sense of having a sober judgment, rather thinking of ourselves in a sober judgment, and in accordance with that measure of faith God's given us, he's building into that relationship. And the deeper my relationship is, I liken it to having a sense of God's heart. It's not just what he wants me to do because it's the word that states the fact. What is his heart? They're one and the same. But when we know his heart, it becomes second nature for us to give to him what he desires, to obey without a sense of feeling oppressed or in any sense of being strong on. It's a sense of as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are those that want hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those that are pure in heart, for they will see God. And that's where Paul wants to take us. He wants to change it. And when he goes into these chapters, which we're going to get into in just a couple of minutes, he gets into some real gritty stuff. What's going on in this church that requires so much that has to be dealt with concerning the sense of accepting one another and being patient with one another. What's going on in this community where something has to be said about responding with a sense of honoring leadership and authority? What's going on? That they have to be reminded that God is sovereign and he does what he will, and we need to be yielded to what it is that he calls us to do. This is where it begins, right here. And as I say context out of the book, I say always keep context within the book. You go into chapter 13 and we do talk about the submission to authorities. Don't go there all by yourself. Go back to chapter 12 and remember, this is an outworking. God sets up certain authorities and he sets up certain guidelines for leadership. And he looks for unity. Don't you think that's what Jesus, particularly when Paul is jumping into the church and talking about that interaction between one another and weaker brother, stronger brother, don't you think that Jesus clearly had that in mind when he had the disciples in the upper room? And he's now praying for them in John 17, praying that they will be one, like you and I are one, praying to the Father, that oneness. Yes. Now think about the fact that he ever lives to intercede for us. So that means every day he's praying for us to be one, to be unified. And the best way that we can understand that, the best way that we can get a hold of that, is once again, recognizing the difference between that which is of the world, and that which is of the Scripture, and that which God's desire and pattern for our life is. And that pattern ought to be like Brother Lawrence of old, practicing the presence of God every day, every hour, every moment. It can be played out and beaten into the ground until it means nothing to you by rote, but what would Jesus do? I received that book when I was 16 years old, my pastor, In His Steps by Sheldon. Long before there were wristbands that had WWJD. What would Jesus do? Which came out of that book. But that is certainly a helpful key to continuing on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour basis to return to the pattern. There's a pattern to follow. Am I fitting into His pattern? Making a list of all the commands and imperatives, you made that list very well. Is there action and attitude is more important than all the rest? Interesting. Some of you picked. One or two of you didn't pick what all the rest of you did. All right? And all the rest of you jumped on verse 9 and said love. I said, well, that's the action or attitude. It's more important than all the rest. One or two of you said, no, there's no one particular attitude that's more important than the other. And I can see where you got that, because obviously you have a statement made in verse 9, love must be sincere. You have a statement in verse 10, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. And then the rest of it goes out, and it goes out like a webwork, honor one another, never lacking zeal, and be joyful, and on. Share, bless. Just a passing comment on that. As I say, both comments can be defended. We're not going to the court case on this. But let's keep in mind the spirit of these three chapters. And the spirit of these three chapters really does come back time and time again. Chapter 13 and verse 9, love your neighbor as yourself. The sense of love is revisited in different statements that verse 8 of chapter 13, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. The context, it's not what this question asks, is there, I'll list here. But let's just keep in mind whether you say, well, not exactly here, but certainly through those three chapters, the outworking and expression, something that's in desperate need these days, always has been. What's love got to do with it? What the world needs now is love. And I get up and use those phrases in sermons, and I'm beginning to do that less and less because I look out at the congregation and I say, I don't have a clue what I'm talking about. Because those songs are long past. But that's been an outcry, and it always has been. So at any rate, it's always possible to be at peace with everyone. That was another interesting one. Some of you say yes, some of you say no, and then one of you said, very, very definitive, yes and no. Okay, all right. And then explain why, and that was fine, I got it. Let me address that. Let's read that passage again. All right. If I can find it. All right, there it is, verse 18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Now, of the different twists and turns that you had given in your answers, this is my counsel to you, because it's a very critical point to follow. If you are going to have peace in your life, relationally speaking, you will have people in your life, and even Christians, who are, they're really outside of the pattern of biblical thinking and action at this point in their life. They're more in a worldly pattern, and they are kind of broken in their relationship in a certain part of the walk. They might be everything from a pastor, Sunday school teacher, to just a regular contributor to the ministry in the pew. But they're just relationally broken. I will step aside on this and say, depending upon how broken they are, will raise question in my mind whether they were ever converted. Because Christ makes it very clear that if we will not forgive, then we cannot be forgiven. And there's a principle that we understand plays out. I mean, I led a person to the Lord, so I believed, and as I was mentoring or as I was discipling them in the months ahead, we reached this place where they just flat out said they would absolutely never be able to forgive, and they won't do it, and got really angry about it and got at him. And I said, well, until that's something you're ready to bring to the table before the Lord, how can we possibly go any farther? I believe that's another issue entirely. But back to you. And you look at this passage and say, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So you've got this person who they don't want to be at peace with you. It can cut right into your family life. My father and mother and I had a relationship down through the years. They were both, they were believers, but they were worldly believers. And there were things that as a young person just happened, and I just move on. But as I became an adult and I went into pastorate, I began to look back at some of these things, and they were just out there. Abuse, some very serious abusive conduct. But I just never thought twice about it. And as the years passed, I thought, well, as it would revisit me, I went to them one afternoon and I said, that's hung in there with me all these years, and I just, however you feel about it, I want you to know it hurt at a deep level, it offended, you broke my heart, and I forgive you for it. They didn't quite get it. But for me to be able to do that and then turn around and walk away, having sincerely done that, and having prayed that God would just work in their hearts, it was a release. And it was a new level of peace that I had with my parents. And I mentioned this because that's how close it can be. And I think that you have relationships in your life that you look at a passage like this, well, it says if at all possible, but it's not possible here. Well, it's possible on your side to just forgive. Forgive in the sense that you will not hold a spirit of bitterness, a spirit of anger, or any nature of that you will forgive them, that you will pray for them, that you will love them. And then it's between them and God. And it's up to them to deal with them, with the Lord. Yeah.
I was going to say, isn't the spirit of that passage, though, for us to let go of it, right? It's not about reconciliation with the other person.
It's for us to be at peace.
Right, it's for us so that we can let go of that and move on with our
These are the
relationships.
things that you have to do.
Right. But that doesn't speak to the other person's willingness
No, it doesn't.
at all, right? Okay.
No, it doesn't. And that's important. Because if you linked it to what the other person was supposed to do, and then you say, well, they didn't do that, so I'm free to still be ill at ease or embittered or whatever.
Right.
So when Paul wrote this, he did write it on one side. Do this. If you take that, now go to the bigger context, okay? And you take the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 5 and Matthew 18, and you say, okay, if your brother has something against you, leave your gift at the altar and go and reconcile. And then if you have something against your brother, go and reconcile. And when you take those two passages and you put them together, you realize that we're never off the hook. If I know that I've offended and God's put it in my heart, I better make that right. In this particular case, you could apply that there. You say, if it's possible. Well, if it's possible, if you know you offended somebody and he doesn't come in or she doesn't come and say something to you, they're just going to let it roll off their back. And you know that you did something and offend and hurt, then you need to make that right. Because the Spirit of God is moving you and making that clear to you. It's not going to roll off your back until you, So at any rate, that is just, it's a portion of reconciliation, but it is in your heart. Steve and Annie Chapman, again, how many of you know them? Christian country singers, Steve and Annie. Had a song in their repertoire that was very well written. I don't know whether they were written, but it builds emotionally as they're singing it about, you hurt me, you offended me, you dealt with me wrongly, and I put you in a cell, and I held you there, and I held you with vengeance, and I held you with my bitterness, and I held you with my anger. And the song goes on and on and on, and then it comes to the last portion of the song, and then you just sit there and you're just overwhelmed because and then the day came that the light dawned, and you were not in the cell. I was in the cell. Because I had put myself through bitterness and lack of. And so, wow. And again, he says, where it's possible, be at peace. Be at peace. And so, moving on from there, when people are different, how is it possible to have the same mind toward one another? Because I'm just going to move quickly into 13, but since people are so different, how is it possible to have the same mind toward one another? Somebody jump in, yeah, go ahead, I'll let you again.
I was just going to say, I think it speaks to your point earlier when we were talking about how can we test the will of God in our lives, and just having His heart and recognizing, now we can actually live in harmony with one another, even if we're different. If we're seeking to see the will of God in our lives, and His will is for us to be in unity, it's something that we actually, for the first time in our lives, it's actually possible to what's what I'm looking for, pursue. We can actually pursue it and actually see it realized because of Christ.
That's relatively what I was going to say. It's about our perspective, right? So we come to the table through Christ, and if we're viewing it through that lens, we should be able to come to an accord together as mutual believers.
Since people are so different, how is it possible to have the same mind toward one another? Now I'm going to touch something that you can struggle with if you will, but I was mentioning this to one of you a few weeks ago. There was a time when I was in Bible college that I had walked through first couple of years theologically on different studies, different subjects, and I had a certain view on a topic, and I was very adamant about it. And I would get into coffee house there at the school, and sit down with one of my brothers in classes, and we would get at that, and they would have a different position, and we would go at it, and it would get sadly very heated. And I've seen that time and again in church over the years where that has also taken place on certain subjects. You don't think like I do. You don't embrace the subject. Herman Lutzer was pastor at Moody Memorial for a number of years, wrote a book, Doctrines That Divide. And doctrines of grace, election, predestination happens to be one of them, the charismatic movement of tongues, and sign gifts is another, and there are different ones. But at any rate, I finally had to come to terms, and there was God sent people into my life that had a sense of this, and I began to think about what I was doing. My father-in-law was my pastor, my mentor, and then my father-in-law. And he and I didn't agree on the rapture. I'm a pre-mill, pre-trib, and he is a pre-mill, pre-trib too. He's with the Lord today, and I won't make any comment there. As to his knowing who's right. I won't say that. But what he means by he's pre-mill, pre-trib is pre-mid-trib, pre-great trib. And so no. And so I returned at one point, thought I had good handle on this, as I was getting older. And I would see the two of us getting overly heated about it. And so I just quit. I wouldn't talk about it anymore. I wouldn't talk about the subject. He was a dyed-in-the-wool pastor deacon believer, meaning the Bible teaches strictly and only that there is one pastor for every church and then deacons. And he did not believe in plurality of elders. And he opposed it like it was anathema. And I was mentored by him and a couple of others that had me thinking along that line in the early days, and I no longer think that way. I am very committed to the idea of plurality of elders and what the Bible teaches concerning it. There again, he wrote a 40-page paper and then wanted me to read it and to send it out to the pastors in the area, wanted them to read it after his retirement. And I wouldn't argue with him, and I wouldn't get into it for this reason. We know the Lord. We have the same mind of what we are desirous to do and to serve and to bring people to Christ and to help people grow in their faith. I'm not going to do it. And that really is the issue. We're going to differ. We're going to differ. Even I might have said a couple of things here. They said, well, that's not where I'm at. I think down through the years, I said, I go to a church, that's where I was ordained of that particular, I was baptized, I was ordained in the Conservative Baptist Church, and that's who I am. I am a Baptist by conviction, by belief, and I am happiest in a Baptist church. That's where I worship. And I have good friends that are not Baptists. Okay, so what about them? Well, there's nothing what about them. They have every right to not be Baptists. And yet, when I was within our Baptist association, where we had all of our churches together that would work on church planting and such, if one of those brothers began to basically express beliefs that were not Baptistic outside, I would be offended by it, and I would sit and talk with them, and I would not cast a vote for them to give any leadership to the association because they were not reflective of what we as a group have come together to embrace and to practice. But if I was involved with them in an evangelical effort, which I have been over the years, we would be solid. You have this over here and you have that over there. And, those are the distinctions that I've made. Live in peace and the mind of Christ as these guys happen to deal with nicely. Every one of you On the study questions on 13. What's verse 8, 9? Is it Chad? Okay, it's not till 14, so I won't get there until 14. Let's just take a look at the, let's keep in mind in chapter 13 the statement, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established by God. Who wrote this? Oh, no, the Spirit of God. Okay, all right now. But who wrote this and led by the Spirit of God?
Paul.
To a church where?
Rome.
Who is the governing authority?
The emperor.
Obviously, he must have been a godly person, right?
Oh, of course.
Set a standard.
Technically, he was a godly person because he saw himself as God.
Oh, well. Well, all right.
All right. Saw himself as a deity. Practice of the Caesar's sexual promiscuity far outstrips anybody that we read about in the news on any given day in our government. They played on both teams. They were everything was open. Why? Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. Those governing authorities. If we keep that in mind, it makes it easier as we look at our governing authorities. And I sat in a service not too many weeks ago, and I thought that everything that the speaker said, and he too wasn't the pastor, but he was just speaking for the day. The pastor's away, and everything he said was going along well and was on point. And then he started in those idiots in Washington, and then a couple of other, and then he'd get some laughter, and he'd say, right, and he offended me. And I look at this passage of Scripture, and while I understand the underlying premise of his displeasure in the policies of the leadership of our country, and I would agree with him concerning that displeasure. I don't, by any means. I pray that God would bring change on all levels. But as a believer, especially especially, whether I'm alone or whether I'm in a pulpit or whether I'm in a mixed crowd, there's no place for me to cast the words of displeasure in such abusive language as that. It shows what? It shows disrespect. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so bring judgment on themselves. And where does he build up on it? Bring it down to the nitty-gritty. He says in verse 6 there, this is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give everyone what you owe them. You owe them taxes, pay taxes, revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. When I look at the authorities and I go through an election, there are times that I feel that democracy is almost detrimental to us. Don't get me wrong, I'm wholeheartedly committed to democracy, but when democracy leads us as believers to believe that we have more authority and power than God does by our vote and our interaction, that we can change things, and that if it doesn't go the way we vote, then we need to rebel and we need to fight against it, then all of a sudden we've lost that. All right, here we go. All of a sudden we've gone from this, our biblical pattern, to this, the worldly pattern of living. And we've taken our, if you will, our democratic right, and, you know, we've played it out. And I can get real personal on this, not personal so much, but let's just say recent. Don't know where you were in January when Congress was stormed, but what happened on that day was not a pattern of Romans 13. And if anybody was there that's a believer, I don't care how strong the belief was, what they did and the manner in which they conducted themselves was dishonorable to God. And certainly, when it says here, pay respect, and such, you know, it just there are no reason. They'll tell you that there are reasons. But let's get to you and to me. We have an obligation to speak and to recognize the fact that God rules. Now, we just went through chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we didn't spend any time. We just bounced across it because there were so many other things I wanted to cover. And I said, if you really want to delve into Romans 8:28, in all things God works together for good for those that love. Go and read Providence, okay? But listen, God raises and God lowers. The bigger context. God raises and God lowers leaders. So God raised the Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament. And he intentionally raised Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar took the people of Israel and brought them into captivity for 70 years, dealt with them harshly. It was Nebuchadnezzar that put Daniel in the lion's den. It was Nebuchadnezzar that put his 3 friends into the fiery furnace. It was Nebuchadnezzar that did all these things. It was Nebuchadnezzar that lost his mind because he saw everything that had been done as his achievement, and God dealt with him. God brought judgment upon Israel for 70 years. God raised up Nebuchadnezzar. And if it has up to an election, nobody would have voted. In Israel, nobody would have voted for Nebuchadnezzar to be king. But God raised him up, and God dealt with Israel in the way that he did to achieve his purpose. And his purpose was to purge Israel, to purify, to chasten, to correct, to bring them back to see not only the wrong, but to move back into a fresh commitment to him. And then he raised up another king by the name of Cyrus, who just said, hey, let's send them back. God did that because God's sovereign. And why do I make reference to these men? Because on any given year, a presidential administration will be raised up. You'll go and vote, and it won't go the way you want. And you'll be offended by all of the things that administration embraces. But we need to step back and allow God to be sovereign and control. And when the dust is settled, when the chips fall, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. And they're really, really bad if we look at different issues. They're really bad. They're probably not as bad as Caesar was. Not that makes them good. But how are we supposed to deal with them? Pay them due respect. Pay them due honor. Ultimately, as a believer, spend a lot of time on our knees praying that God will change their hearts.
I think, again, when we look at the spirit of what we're talking about, and we tie it back to even to the last chapter, how we were talking about it, about how it's like our Christian perspective that changes how we are to the world. You know, like you're a military guy. You may have taken some of the same notes I took from it, though. It's like you may not like the individual above you, but you honor and respect the rank and the position. I mean, I think that's what we're being called to do here.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, we don't have to esteem the people, you know, but you have to esteem the position, you know, as appointed by God, right? I mean,
there you have it. You respect the presidency, but on the other hand, you don't want to disrespect in the words that you use, because that's kind of tied together.
Right.
The thing that struck me the most reading this is how it ties back into the Old Testament, like right after the Ten Commandments, Exodus 22:28, do not revile God or curse your leaders.
Right.
Right up, you know, it's right there. And then, you know, of course, this theme is repeated a couple of times throughout Scripture. But the fact that, you know, it was set in stone, again, the same thing, just as God raised Pharaoh up for his greater purpose. That was where it really just hit home for me, that, you know, right, I don't have to like what's going on, but I have to respect it.
Right? When you go back that far, and you see Korah and the gang that followed him, and you see God dealing with them because of their rebellion against Moses, come back to chapter 12 of Romans, and say, therefore, you know, in view of his mercy, conform not to the pattern of the world, but transform the renewing of your mind, and be able to test and approve. He's drawing and calling a sense of our aligning ourselves with the heart of God. So when I study the Old Testament, I carry that with me. And I study the Old Testament, recognizing that there is much in the Old Testament that is committed to the ceremonies, much that's committed to time restrictions of God having dealt with a society in a certain way. But I look for the heart of God. And on this subject, over and over and over again, when rebellion rose, you can see through the words of the prophets or through the events, as in the case with Korah and those, that God was, his wrath was heated. He dealt firmly. He dealt forcefully. And it is and always has been a theocracy that we live under. Not a democracy, not a kingship. It is a theocracy. And quite honestly, God stated outright, he saw it coming, he spoke of it through previous occasions. He even went in Deuteronomy, spoke, there will be a time, there will be a king. But when they came and said, we want a king like all the rest of the nations, God expressed through Samuel his displeasure because they were rebelling. Then that's the word we can leave chapter 13 with. When you refuse to acknowledge this and when you fight against it, that's the word, rebellion. And remember that as Solomon brought this, or as Samuel brought the point to the table, that rebellion is likened to the sin of witchcraft. And how is it that he could make that statement? Because God is sovereign, he's the king, he's the one to whom we yield and we pattern our lives as he reveals himself and his heart and his instruction to us. And when we reject any of this, we reject him. Yeah.
So what's the answer for A when you bring it up?
Which one?
When
We're
is it
still on
necessary?
13. When is it necessary for
Yeah.
believers to obey or disobey?
Yeah.
I think you all answered it pretty well, and again, you come back to the passage, another contextual passage in Acts where, Peter said, you have to judge whether we should obey God or obey you. So, if the government, and let's not open, we'll take the whole night on this one, let's not open this too far. If the government says to the church, you may never again meet publicly, then, and make it a law, then we will disobey the law.
Good enough.
Okay, we will disobey that law. I worded that carefully. If the government comes along and says it is on the basis of medical and social concern for this immediate time, this month or next month, we're asking that the church refrain from public gatherings larger than, da-da-da-da. I get it. And I think that begins to gel into the, you think this way, I think that way. See, I'm okay with that, okay? And I was a very strong proponent. I said, okay, now what do we do? And so let's get online, and let's get in small groups, and let's just And I said, hey, listen, they've been meeting in house churches in China and in Korea for like forever, okay? And so that was the early church, by the way. When you're looking in Acts 2 and Acts 3 and Acts 1, they're little house churches. So just because you can't meet in a big cathedral, with 400 people, doesn't mean you can't meet. You say, well, you can meet in your home or whatever. So the government didn't say you cannot meet. And just put these guidelines in for a period of time. Now there were some who they were going to take it to the bank. And I'll not mention names here, but they pushed it to the limit of getting fined and getting, we're going to go dig toe to toe with the government. They felt that was right. This is, like I said, this is a thing. And if that's right for them, there was not where I was going to be. Okay. So, but if it was a flat out law.
Yeah,
No.
I got you.
No. If they tell me that I can't preach on anything in the scriptures that addresses a particular sin practice, such as homosexuality, I will disobey that. Because I will preach the whole content of the Word of God, the whole counsel of God, not just bits and pieces.
Yeah. Just to go off your point, I think even in those examples of the Old Testament rules and things that we were talking about before, I mean, you've got Moses. It's not God raised up Moses
Yes.
in opposition to Pharaoh, right?
Right.
With
Yes.
with Nebuchadnezzar, he used Daniel, right? Like,
Right.
I don't think Romans 13 is saying it's blind obedience, but it's okay in reference to God as the higher power. Okay, if they're saying if the government is saying to do something against what God would have us to do, or the government is saying to do something sinful, all right, well then we've got to.
Right. In bringing Daniel into that, which you just said, is a perfect example of how we should respond in a setting where there is a godlessness and a drive toward ungodly living and such, and a pressure as he's thrown in, and as the, as this dear friends is thrown. What did he do? Morning, noon, and night. He prayed, he prayed, he prayed, he prayed, he prayed, he prayed. And God delivered, and God blessed, and he continued to rise up to become prime minister. I mean, it was this, and that's where we should take very serious note and make very great commitment to our praying for our president, whoever he is. No matter how much we're offended, pray that the hand of God will come upon him, upon he and the administration, those that sit in Congress, those that sit in Senate, those that sit in the Supreme Court, and that God will change hearts, and God will bring in an influence that will lead toward a movement. And I honestly believe that the discussion about Roe versus Wade right now is only a result of God's people not giving up, but continuing to pray, to pray, to pray, to pray. All right, chapter 14. Chapter 14 gets into the meats. And mind you, as I read through this, I wanted to be sure that larger context, when you looked at the statement that and the portion that Paul wrote on this subject in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, where at the end of chapter 8 of 1 Corinthians 8, verse 13, he says, therefore, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause him to fall. Over here, he's talking about days. He's talking about the difference between the strong and the weak. And he gets into the whole attitude in verse 22. So whatever you believe about these things, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the man who does not condemn himself by what he approves. But the man who has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from faith. Everything that does not come from faith is sin. Keep that in mind that, Paul is addressing this into two different churches. And he's hitting at things that really bring home the fact that the churches constantly pray toward division. And for them, at that particular point in time, and which is the weaker, clarify that with me in your mind. I want to be sure that you understand who's the strong brother and who's the weak brother. Let me put it in this word, because it's not, okay, maybe this will be easier. I totally abstain from alcohol. Am I a weak or am I a strong brother?
I do too, so, strong.
Anybody else?
I like that.
Anybody else?
I'd say strong.
I'm a weak brother. And it's because there's a statement that we find in Paul's statement to Timothy, that he should drink a little wine for his health. And it's an understanding that alcohol is not, we can't find a flat-out statement in the Scriptures that is totally, completely prohibited. Drunkenness is, but alcohol is not. Now, I'm a weak brother. I totally abstain. I know full well that there are brothers that are, very sincere men who walk with men, women who walk with God, who will have a glass of wine. I'm potentially, offended. I know two pastor friends of mine went to lunch, and one said to the other, "You don't mind if I order a beer?" And he said, "Yeah, I do." He said, and with different reasons.
Did he order the beer?
Did I what?
Did he order the beer?
No.
Well, good for him.
And I think that this is a good reason right here that he didn't order the beer, because it's okay. I'm also a weaker brother because I was a functioning alcoholic. I, coming out of the military, I was away from God, just hand over fist. And I would, many weeks, drink my entire paycheck. And I wouldn't have enough for lunch during the week ahead, because that was my weekend. My parents were heavy drinkers too. I totally abstained for that reason, because I know there was something in my life that got hold of me in a way. I totally abstained because I was a pastor, and I don't want to be a stumbling block to a weaker brother. But for me, it's not a weaker brother, we're on the same ground. A good pastor friend of mine out in Pennsylvania, and pastored in Hughesville for a number of years, similar background as mine, but to such a degree, he would not go to a restaurant. If we had a pastor's breakfast where there was a bar in that restaurant, he wouldn't come. We had to choose a place, and in Williamsport area, we could find them. I went out there and I was dumbfounded, because I came off Long Island. I said, "What do you mean?" We were going to do a dinner, a church dinner, and they said, "Well, we picked this great place, had a nice venue and everything," and people said, "No, we can't go there." I said, "Why not?" I said, "Because they serve alcohol on the premise." See, okay, and I said, "Okay, fine. You're telling me there is a places that don't serve alcohol?" Well, of course, and I was shocked, because I grew up on Long Island. You could buy alcohol at the local grocery store and local drug store, any place, go down to a hamburger joint. And you couldn't get it at McDonald's, but, in Friendly's, that about it. Anyway, obviously I have real concern, and I don't want to offend, and I don't want to be a stumbling block to my brother. And there are a lot of other things. Let's talk about what other things are. Besides eating, not eating specific foods, observing certain days. And he talks about that whole idea. What can we list today that may cause divisive opinions among Christians? This was quite a hoot. Every single one of you. I won't even go there. I won't even let you go there. I'll just put it out there. Every single one of you put vaccinations. Every one of you.
That's the current issue.
Current issue, that's right.
I didn't.
You didn't? Really? I didn't see yours? And you didn't? Okay, it just seemed to me as I was rolling through each and every one.
I put it in.
You did, yeah. What other things?
I put particular genres of music to listen to, Bible translations, gifts of the Holy Spirit.
Okay, yeah. And not everybody did that. And that's something that really does come to mind quite often is the music.
Yep.
Worship wars. Now, this is the year 2021. Worship wars started 25 years ago, if not earlier. 5, 10, 28, 88, yeah, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, contemporary music was beginning to be pushed into the church by younger or more contemporary thinkers. I like to say, I like to occasionally say I like my rock and roll, and that seemed to be the way an awful lot of people have gone. But how was it done? Let's keep this in mind. This became the real argument back in the day.
It only takes a spark to get a fire going.
Yeah, see, here's a voice. Yeah, here it comes. Should have told Luther that, because this is what I'm going to say. Luther looked at the church and looked at the manner in which, okay, Rocky. Just remember, we want to be not stumbling blocks to one another. Right? Beautiful. Let us therefore, verse 19, therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. But the idea with Luther on that music thing was, he looked at the staid and the real rigid type of music within the church, and so he started taking the melodies out of the bars and putting new words to them. See, once somebody does that, it becomes a precedent. And some of those hymns that we embrace and love so dearly and say, well, that's just truly godly music. And then we look at the music that is contemporary, but that's not godly music because of its contemporariness. Yeah, we need to stop and think a little bit more carefully about that. That's just my read on it. But you can certainly look at it your way, and we'll, be at peace with each other, because we don't want to cause division. And I think that within the church, one side or the other, if you insist on driving the wedge, you're being divisive. If you're insistent on dividing the church, I tell people this flat out. Look, if our church ended up, and my wife was music director, and formally as staff member in my last church for almost 20 years, and she and I chose a path of blended worship. We had contemporary music, we had hymns, and the people within the church were mixed people of old school and younger. And it worked. We didn't have wars. We dealt with people, and in some cases, somebody wanted to use a tambourine, and they thought this was a great idea, and then somebody mentioned to me they thought it looked like the Salvation Army, and they were offended, and so, okay, we made an adjustment. Say, you know what? We really don't need the tambourine. I mean, and it was just a thing. We kind of worked our way through the shoals, if you will, and we maintained peace. This is the kind of pattern, I think, that the Lord wants us to, whatever the issues may be in the church. Now, you also talked about Bible translations. I've seen churches just go bizarre. And what I say to somebody, they come into church, well, you're using the wrong translation, or they come in and say, you're using contemporary music, and I don't like it. I say, well, without being offensive to an individual, I say, look, there are a lot of gospel preaching churches in any community I've ever been in, a lot. There were so many in Williamsport, I mean, just, you could pick about every 2 blocks, there was another gospel church of a different shade. No disrespect to an individual, but say, there are a lot of churches to choose. Don't choose one that you see you're disagreeable with because of their music or because of their translation. Choose one that you can agree with, not just theologically. Why do you think a church will sit back and say, if you're going to become a member of the church, it's important that you sign our doctrinal statement? Well, why is that so important? Because it's important that we are of one mind. And so here's the doctrinal statement. Now, no church is going to sit back and say, you're going to only become a member of the church if you agree with contemporary music, or you agree with traditional music, or you agree with the King James Version or the New American Standard. But I think that an individual should be, thoughtful about Will this offend me? Will this bother me too much? Will it become an issue of divisiveness? Not gonna make it happen, not gonna let it happen. So I'll find a church where I fit in theologically and philosophically. Those are two terms. That is where Paul was driving at. And so you can come up with a lot of different reasons. I will say that you got to be careful, the things that are biblically taught are not matters of division. Homosexuality is not a matter of, well, you think your way and accept it. No, that's not. Sex before marriage is not. There are other things that you can come up with, I'm sure. But I think basically most all of you had items that were just a matter of discussion. We're on different pages. It goes back to the question before. We're on all the same mind. Right? From the section versus Listolian person, okay, man. Do you have any? That's pretty much it. I will say this. I'm going to throw this out. I have a good friend. He and his wife were involved in one of my churches, one of the churches I pastored. And I preached on this material. I preached on this, and I preached on the subject matter. And then getting right down to what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 8:13. If I offend, and I cause a stone in the brother, I'll just never eat meat again. That's quite a statement. And basically what he's saying is that, my freedom is not so important that I can't reduce it for the sake of someone else. Limit it for the sake of someone else. Now, I taught this, and my friend's wife was, she was right on point, all the way through. And then, she was taking a whole bunch of kids from the church to the movies on a regular basis. I said, sister, some people are offended at that. Well, I'm not going to change my lifestyle because they can't get with it. I said, well, you didn't get it,